Hi, everyone, and welcome to The Path to Reason. I'm your host, Cindy Plaza, and tonight I have the pleasure to invite Richard Carrier. Doctor, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you.
So today the topic is critical thinking, which is a big surprise considering the tone of my channel. But before we're going into your presentation, we're going to go deep inside this. I'm going to ask you a question that I ask all my guests, and the question is: if we remove all the scientific, all the critical thinking side of you, who are you? What's left? Who are you as a human being? Who is Mr. Richard Carrier?
Oh gosh, see, critical thinking. That's just the thing is it informs every aspect of me, really. Yeah, I'm a philosopher, historian, writer, hedonist, polyamorist. A lot of different possible ways to explore my identity besides that, but they all involve critical thinking. You need to go through life using critical thought. It improves everything from your emotional health all the way to your politics, right? And how well you operate as a citizen for the benefit of other citizens and for your nation and yourself.
Yes, that's one of the questions I get very often in France and Belgium, where religion is much less prevalent than in the US, is why are you fighting religion? It's not existent here. Well, it is because even though people are much less religious here, this way of thinking, this authoritarian way of thinking, it impacts every other aspect of your life. So yeah, it's important everywhere.
Yeah, I would say especially, I mean, it's mostly, I apologize on behalf of the United States. It's mostly us, but or the problem, but, anyone who's working anywhere in the world, you can get eyes in America. So if you can do anything to influence our progress towards more secularity, that's always a good thing. But I find even we have now secular ideologies. I mean, you can talk about from everything from libertarianism to Marxism to QAnon, all of these other things that are rising, I think, are really replacing religions. But they're just like religions. They really are religions and suffer all the same problems and cause all the same problems that religions do. So I think you're letting something sneak up on you if you only focus on religion and say, oh, religion's gone, we don't need to worry about it anymore. It's like, no, we've got it coming back. It's coming back in a non-supernatural form. It's the same kind of lack of critical thinking that's leading to false worldviews that are toxic and harmful and bad for people, bad for themselves, not just for their societies. So we need critical thinking for that. And I've written an article a while ago called What's the Harm? Even addressing liberal religions, like very liberal thinking, very progressive religions that aren't very dogmatic or fundamentalist. Even they require you to sort of sacrifice some of your critical thinking. And that's dangerous because that can be exploited. It's like leaving a hole that hackers can get in and hack your mind, basically. So if you want to have good, virus control, good hacking control, good operational security on your mind, you need to have critical thinking. It's the same set of skills, and being able to figure out what's wrong with religion is the same set of skills that you apply to figure out what's wrong with a secular ideology or false belief.
So how would you define critical thinking?
Yeah, that's a good question, right? Yeah. So, I mean, it's thinking and it's critical. So thinking probably doesn't require too much. But there is a difference. There's people who don't think, right? They just naively, right. They just go through life absorbing things rather than thinking about them, or rather than thinking about themselves or self-analysis, the self-examined life. Thinking is important, but you have to do it critically, right? And so you can have the extreme where you have, flat earthers, let's say, which is a phenomenon now that's still happening, that will accept certain sources and reject certain sources simply to agree with their worldview. So what they'll do is they'll be super excessively critical with things they don't want to be true. So they're excessively skeptical. They over doubt things that conveniently they need to doubt, and then are overly gullible for things that they need to believe. So when you say critical thinking, what you mean is finding the Aristotelian mean, the middle ground in there, where you're not overly skeptical, but you're not overly gullible, where you're being reasonable in the way that you apply, the way that you're critiquing it. And the critiquing of it should have the goal of figuring out what to trust and what not, rather than deciding in advance what to trust and what not. The critical part is, okay, how much of this can I trust? Why can I trust it? Even if it's telling me things I don't want to hear, right? So critical thinking should have the goal of accepting certain things, of actually having beliefs and forming new beliefs and stuff. So critical doesn't mean rejecting everything, criticizing everything. It means subjecting things to criticism and then seeing what survives that criticism. And then it's all a question of how competent is your critical method. And that's how I advocate critical thinking.
Okay. And how would you define rational thinking?
Yeah, that's a good one too. You know what? So there's kind of a lot of people who claim to, a lot of people, probably most people claim to be rational. They're nothing of the kind. And so I think people don't really carefully define what rational means. I try to avoid the word actually as much as possible, because it's kind of a buzzword that people just assume, oh, well, I'm rational, therefore he's talking about how I think about things. And it's like, no, not necessarily. I mean, in the simple philosophical sense, rational thinking means thinking without fallacy, right? So that none of your conclusions are being drawn from premises fallaciously. So it's a fallacy avoidance, basically, is what rational thought should be. But also it should be evidence-based thinking. You're not sitting in the armchair and making up excuses to believe something, but actually going out and checking what the evidence actually says. And it might not say the things that you expect it to say. You do need to go out and find out. You need to check the evidence. So for me, rational thinking is evidence-based reasoning. And it's doing it with deliberate effort to avoid any kind of fallacious inferences.
And you also have the side that being rational is also, there's a different meaning, that it's using the right means to achieve the goal you set yourself. Because
yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Yes, that's also a meaning of rational. If I set myself a goal, and then anything that is in accordance to this goal and will help me reach this goal will be rational, whether it's logical or not, whether it's true or not, whether it's, and sometimes these different meanings, they confuse people.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah, right. Yeah, I know. I focus, so like I said, I avoid the word rationality as much as I can and focus on epistemology, your theory of knowledge. And I do make the case, and I extensively make the case, why you need to make sure your beliefs are true. And my article, What's the Harm, is kind of about like the idea that you can use false beliefs to get to a particular goal, I think has the disadvantage that the epistemology you have to adopt to believe those false beliefs is going to cause errors in many other domains, pursuing many other goals. And so what you need is a reliable epistemology. Now, it just so happens that a reliable epistemology is not going to make it easy to believe false things. And so, false beliefs fall by the wayside, essentially. That's sort of the collateral damage of this. But then, of course, what you want to do is, well, how do I work with the truth then? Rather than trying to believe certain things that are false, can I cope with life? Can I enjoy life? Can I make progress in all my goals through the truth rather than false beliefs? And the answer is yes. And that's part of where critical thinking comes in, is where you figure out how to do that. And that's a much better way to live, in my opinion. And that's what I advocate a lot on my website and in my writings.
It's interesting because I don't have the exact same vision than you just described. On my course, I told you I developed a critical thinking course.
Yeah, I'm interested to hear how you organize that and what skills you teach in it. So proceed. I want to hear this. Yeah.
So basically, you can think of it like an arrow. At the top of the arrow, you have rational thinking, which is it's a goal. You'll never reach it because we are fallible creatures. Mm-hmm. We have flawed thinkers. So what we want is to think as rationally as possible, as often as possible.
Yeah.
It's like saying, I want to become a strong person mentally, for example. You're not going to become, at some point, you're not going to become, okay, today I'm strong, yesterday I wasn't, today I am. It's not how it works. you develop tools to react in a better way, in a stronger way every time you're facing a problem. And rational thinking to me is the same. You have tools like critical thinking and other things that help you be more rational when you need to think. And so rational thinking to me is the addition of critical thinking and knowledge. I see them as both sides of a coin, because you need both. You need knowledge to understand critical thinking, and you need critical thinking to make sure your knowledge is true and get rid of the bad knowledge. So both are extremely complementary in my opinion, and that's how I design my course. So the goal is rational thinking, and first we're going to talk about knowledge. And part of what's important to know is I realized that we tend to understand very little of how our mind works, and that causes a lot of errors in reasoning. Like, for example, what a belief is, how we create beliefs, and all that. And so I think we need to understand at least a little bit how our mind works, how we associate everything we can, and this is the basics. And from that, we draw the I'm not forgetting the word, the cognitive biases, because they are linked to the way we think. Yeah. And so once we saw that, then we go to critical thinking, which is I'm using the Robert Ennis's definition, which is a set of tools and know-hows to reach rational thinking. So we have it's 12 and 14, 12 tools and 14 know-hows, or the other way around. And so one is real mechanical tools like logic, like things we can use to evaluate an argument, like science. Also, all these are tools. And then you have mental postures, which is how you need to trigger your mind in order to start the use of the tools, because you can know everything you want.
Yeah, this is good. I actually
there is to know.
I agree with everything you're saying. I love it. Give me an example of the triggers that you were just talking about, the last thing you just mentioned.
Skepticism is a trigger. You have an information coming, and skepticism triggers the verification of this information. And so if it's an argument, then you will take the tool logic. If it's a claim from someone, then you will trigger the tool source verification. If it's something like a scientific claim you hear, then you'll go to science. And so that's intellectual honesty is also mental posture.
Right,
and
yeah.
That's how Robert Ennis puts it. And I love it because I think it's very elegant, and it's very accurate too, because you need to train yourself first to start those questions to ask, and then you try to find the answer.
What do you work from an Ellis book, like one of his books, or?
I didn't take his books entirely. I worked from studies about his books.
Okay, right.
I was in contact. Yeah, I was in contact with. Maybe you've heard of him, Jacques Boisvert. He's a Canadian scientist. So he wrote a book about 30 years ago. And he picked up all the definitions of critical thinking, and he put them inside one book. And so during my researches,
I'm interested in this. So what's the name of that book?
Jacques Boisvert, but you can't find it anymore. It's not printed anymore, the book.
Oh, that's a shame.
I went directly to him, and he's been kind enough to give me a lot of his time. And we talked a lot about these different visions. So he used to study the Robert Ennis version and Paul's version. I don't remember his name, Robert Paul, I think. And Paul had a three parts definition, which is tools, know-hows, and emotions. So he says there's an emotional component because you need, since we are emotional-based creatures, we need to have an emotional justification to want to trigger the verification. So
yeah, absolutely true.
I like both, but I went with Ennis's because I liked it better.
Okay, yeah. I mean, a lot of the similar things are approaches that I take in my class too. I organize it differently. Since I'm only doing a 1 month, self-directed, short course, I focus on basically 3 things principally, which I think everybody needs. The full critical thinking kit requires 3 things. And you mentioned one of them, which is that cognitive science aspect. Just basically instruction manual for how your brain works, right? All the ways it doesn't work. You got to know those things so you can work around them. And so you know that those errors are happening all the time, right? You just can't count on your brain being perfectly engineered. It wasn't perfectly engineered. So we need these sort of software patches to be aware to sort of fix all of these mistakes that our brain routinely makes. So that's 1/3 of it, is knowing the brain, knowing how the mind works, knowing how beliefs are formed, knowing all the bad ways and wrong ways and erroneous ways beliefs are formed in the brain. And then the other is standard logic, right? Just fallacy detection, syllogistic reasoning, just figuring out how to structure something and analyze it logically so that you can find the flaws in it if there are any. And also being able to keep yourself from resorting to these kinds of flaws of reasoning. I mean, there's a whole science of this logic where people have figured out like the most common ways that people sort of flub their reasoning. And so it's really handy to detect this in other people, but it's also even more handy to be able to see it in yourself so you can stop doing it. And that's the other third. And then the last third is I focus on probability, because all knowledge is probabilistic. You got to get away from black and white thinking. That's actually one of the cognitive science elements, is the brain wants to push things into one category or another. It's either absolutely true or absolutely false, or you can doubt it, completely doubt it, or you have to totally believe it. But no, there's different degrees of probability, and you need to be able to work with that competently. And our brains are not well designed for this, actually. So teaching probability theory is a big part of it. Now, of course, I'm a Bayesian, so I teach Bayes' theorem at the rudimentary what we call in America the 6th grade level, which is, I can't remember what age, but it's preteen, I think, and like a tween age. So it's very low level math, but everybody should have it. Everybody should know how to do basic probability math, because especially nowadays, everything is so awash in numbers and statistics. But even stuff that isn't is still probabilistic. You're still talking about probabilities, and the same kind of things that can trip you up in statistics can trip you up in ordinary thinking, and you don't even know that math is involved in what you're thinking. Because you're not putting numbers to it. You don't see it as math, but even in reality, you're thinking of relative degrees of probability, nesting of probability, and there's a variety of different aspects of that. So I focus on that as the last third. And then I do 4 units. So the 4th unit, I integrate these things, and I do bring up, like you just mentioned, the importance of emotion. In fact, the way I frame it is that emotions are the reason we do anything at all, right? Everything is a management of our future emotions, whether they be happy or sad, right? All critical thinking, all knowledge, all epistemology is emotion management in reality. And it's a question of using the truth, access to the truth, as a way to have a good management of improving your emotional states in the future. Like that's the ultimate goal, as opposed to the Vulcan idea where like, well, we're totally not emotional. We're going to be just strictly rational, and emotions are not going to enter into it. It's like, no, you can't do that. If you had no emotions, you wouldn't care about rationality, right? There's definitely emotions going on. And if you don't even know emotions are driving what you're doing, that's worse. So that you really do need to know what emotions are operating and how they are important in deciding which things to pursue and why, and how they could also be leading you to false beliefs. It's another thing, but emotions can lead you to true beliefs. Emotions can motivate you to be critical in a productive way rather than a completely destructive way. So I bring in emotionality too. I think that's really important.
Yeah, because we need to, when you ask people whether they think truth is important, you know that 99% person will say they are, but when you start getting to the core beliefs, if they're wrong, then they will prefer, sometimes they will prefer a comforting lie rather than an inconvenient falsehood. But this this feeling that we want to know true things, that's mostly emotional, and for every person there's a different reason.
And for most everyone, there's multiple reasons simultaneously, right? And the best way is if you can bring those out in people. Of course, that requires a particular kind of teaching where you're doing like classroom interaction kind of thing, which is more expensive and time consuming to do. In a way, you really need to, if you can't do that, you need to encourage people to get that kind of interaction in the world, because that's what helps you develop in a much more Socratic way, become wiser. I mean, you mentioned knowledge. I think, you have intelligence, which is not knowledge. Intelligence is how you solve problems, like how clever you can be at like putting pieces of information together. Then you have information, which is just data. And then you have knowledge, which you get out of information. But then you have wisdom, right? So wisdom is, you can have people who have tons of knowledge and have no wisdom. Wisdom is people who like see the big patterns from knowledge and therefore can understand. They actually have understanding and comprehension of what's going on in the world, or what's going on in a particular situation, where knowledge alone is not enough. And so getting that extra step to being a wise person, having wisdom, requires both experience but also skills, like we're talking about here, the critical thinking skills that actually translate and transfer, like basically churn knowledge into wisdom. And that's, I think, why it's important to, and that's why I also think like the comforting falsehoods is actually, that's a trap, because that can block you from discovering things you really do need to understand. And it can also be exploited, right? You can be exploited by your false beliefs, can be a lever that other people can exploit you. And if you want to defend yourself against that, you really do need to have a more constructive truth-seeking epistemology. And that's the approach that I take.
Yeah, the problem with the argument that it might get you to not understanding things that you need to understand. I was talking about this yesterday, I think. It's that as human beings, we tend to be concerned only about what's right in front of us, the immediate danger, and not what's going to happen in a year or 10 years. And so, sometimes this argument doesn't seem to work.
Yeah, well, you have to get people to see that, right? That's, I think, that's one of the steps towards wisdom is understanding that narrow-sightedness is bad for you. And it's also not just in time, but it's also in space. Like if people don't see something happening, they'll have a tendency to believe that it's not happening. We have this problem in the US with the pandemic right now, is that people don't see, like they're not in the ICUs, they're not in the hospitals, they don't see the deaths. So it's just a bunch of numbers to them. So they can just be excessively skeptical. Another example of being too skeptical. They just doubt everything and don't believe that there's 600,000 people, over 500,000 people have died in a year. But because they don't see it, right? If they don't see it, it isn't happening. And that's a very narrow-minded view that can lead to your own destruction, can lead to errors in your own life, bad outcomes in your own life, and also hurts everyone around you. Like you really do need to be conscious of what's going on that's not just right in front of you. And I think learning critical thinking does that. And I find that younger generations are getting this more, I think, than older generations are, for a variety of reasons. I find it's, I think people underestimate how smart and savvy, at least teenaged citizens of our country can be, or of any country can be. I think it's an untapped resource, or an not respected resource, but it should be, because they are actually on it way more than, and I deal with, if I deal with like 30-year-olds to 50-year-olds that are just practically children in the way they reason. And then you see these teenagers are like way ahead of them in their smartness and their critical thinking. That's something that we need, but I don't think it's our schools that's teaching it. I think they're learning it. I think they're teaching each other it, right? They're learning it on their own, which is a shame. And we could be teaching them these skills much more directly certainly at the high school level, which is primary. No, that's secondary school. I forget which direction it goes, but the last 4 years of before college. we should really be teaching these skills. Cognitive science, like brain science, this basic understanding of how the brain works and thinks and belief formation. Wouldn't that be the most, I mean, you're supposed to be educating them. Wouldn't how their brain works as far as education goes be one of the most important skills to teach them? I think we should be doing that way more than we are.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons why they are so much more educated on these matters is because they tend to be more open to the world than our generation, especially in the US.
Oh yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Yeah, openness to experience is one of those personality measures. Is actually really crucial. And you notice if you have ambiguity tolerance and openness to experience, those two personality traits, which would be dispositions, like you're talking about mental attitudes. If you have those, you actually tend to have broader understanding of the world, and it just so happens it correlates very strongly with liberal and progressive politics. So, like they say, politics, reality has a liberal bias, or it leans a little bit towards the liberal side of things. But and you see why when you have this openness to experience and the ability to be tolerant of ambiguity and uncertainty, so you're more able to deal with it. Rather than swinging to black and white positions or extreme positions. And so that allows you to expand your knowledge. And once you do that, once you see more things than you're being told about, you start to realize there's a disconnect between what your parents are telling you or what the previous generation's telling you and what actually is going on. And then you have to start developing skills. Well, what do I do with this conflict? And the resolution is what events, they end up reinventing the wheel all the time, what we call critical thinking, learning the same skills. And also the way that the internet has reality distortive properties. So like we know there's tons of misinformation and even deliberate misinformation on the internet. The younger generations grew up with this, so they know that's the case. It's not like they're naively just stumbling across the internet and believing everything they run into there. Whereas the older generations are less used to that. So they're actually more prone to just believe whatever they find on the internet. The younger generations tend to be more skeptical. And that's, again, now they have to learn skills to navigate this. Like there's all this misinformation. How do I find the stuff to trust? And then so they have to reinvent the wheel again, figure out the skills to do that. But I think we could be doing a better service by giving them these packages of skills earlier on.
Yeah, so that's a nice segue, because the topic of tonight was how can we teach critical thinking? And so I think we can teach it maybe in primary school, maybe before. At least some aspects of it, like intellectual honesty, like being able to say I don't know. Things like that can be taught at a very, very young age.
Oh yeah. No, I agree. There's lots of aspects to this. I mean, there's just a straightforward part of it, which is like when I went to high school, the last stage of school before college here in America, I majored in science. I took all my electives as science courses. And so I took physiology, which is super helpful for understanding nutrition and health. And I'm much savvier and smarter about healthcare and various things like that and diet because I took that course. So that was a super useful course. Some people will take, finances, learn how to balance a checkbook, learn how interest rates work and things like that. And so like they're actually much more skilled in basic life things that other people aren't. So we could just teach straightforward. You can have a cognitive science class that just teaches you this is how belief works in the brain, etc. You can just have a logic class. This is do logic and fallacies and stuff. So like we can teach just the basic skills, but then there's that integrative aspect that you're talking about, which is how do you put those skills together and apply them? And I think that does require actual hands-on experience like this. You have to pose them real world issues. And so go do your best to solve this. How do you do this? And that gets you to the basic toolkit of things like one of the questions I always teach is if you hear anything, new information, whatever it is, one of the first things you should ask is, if that was false, how would I know it? Right? What is so you should always be questioning how would I know that's false? And then, so it's the falsification rather than verification, where you go looking for, you cherry pick evidence that supports it. You go try your best to prove it false. And when you fail, well, now it's probably true, right? Because it's, if it's hard to prove false, it's probably true. And so teaching people those skills, how do you just basically considering the possibility that it's false, but rather than just making that a decision is I'm going to decide whether it's true or false. Say, well, how do you actually know? whether it's true or false, right? And so that'll motivate them to look for the skills and the techniques to figure out, well, how do I tell the difference between what's true and false, other than what I want to be true, which, that's another issue of mental stances. Don't choose what you want to be true. Actually figure out, how would you know regardless of what you want to be the case? So it's these kinds of things, like it's this as simple as just telling someone and then giving them examples of it and then having them practice it on real world things. And I think that's one of the reasons, at least in America, why we don't see real critical thinking taught in school level, is because what that does is what you end up with is a bunch of kids who come home, start questioning everything their parents are telling them, right? Which is actually a good thing, but their parents don't like it. So they usually gets these classes killed or watered down, because the last thing parents want is kids actually asking questions. But that's what we want as a nation and as citizens. We really do want kids to do that. And I think that's one of the things, is teaching people to ask questions. And I've noticed parenting matters a lot in this. I see a lot of different parenting styles in my life. And the ones that turn out the smartest kids, that are the savviest kids, the wisest kids early on, are the ones where they let their kids ask questions and they tell them the truth. They just answer the question, right? And they don't try to lie. They don't try to hide. But no, they just, if you're old enough to ask the question, okay, let's sit down and answer that question. And they encourage questioning rather than shutting them down. Like, rather than saying like, well, just do it. Stop asking questions. Just do it because I told you. Don't use that style. Use all right, let's have a discussion about why I think you should do this certain thing. And it gets them used to the cognitive style of questioning why you should do something. And then the end result, they'll get used to seeing that the end result sometimes is, yes, it's right, I should do that. That's right. So it's like learning how to critically think is a part of parenting style. It can't just be taught by schools. In a sense, it's, then they're thinking like, how do we teach parents to be better parents and raise smarter kids? And this is part of it, in my perspective.
Yeah, there's also the aspect that we need to teach that when we don't have the answer, it's a good thing, because it allows us to go and search for it.
Yeah,
and
right.
This step to I don't know to I'm going to look for the answer.
Yes, that's
that
crucial.
Needs to be taught too. Yeah,
you're right. Yeah. Teaching that as a cognitive style. I see that also in difference in parenting too, is the idea of like, they just make up an answer versus, you know what, I don't know, let's go find out. And they take their kid with them to go actually figure out the thing together. And so their kids learn how to do this, and that this is a thing that you can do and that you should do. No, you're absolutely right. I think that is one of the most crucial skills. And it's right up there with the learning, being comfortable asking questions and being accepted for asking questions. But with a genuine desire to know, rather than, you can have the trolling version of asking questions where you don't really want to know the answer. You're just using questions to sort of harass or avoid. No, you want sincere questions. When you're asking questions, make them sincere, right? Make sure that you're sincerely looking for what is true. These are things that you just have to tell people. Like a lot of people just haven't even heard this said to them in their entire life. And so I think you're right. There's like sort of these basic things we take for granted that are necessary steps for cultivating the mindset. And then you can set that mindset loose and practice on things and start to figure out the answers to questions.
So what do you think would be appropriate to teach in kindergarten, for example?
Yeah, I was anticipating this question, and I was thinking about it, and this is outside my wheelhouse, I have to say. So I've had experience teaching critical thinking and similar skills and knowledge at the high school level, but a little bit before, I know from, like I said, I've been observing parents and how they've cultivated these skills in their kids. But by the time you get before age 9, I really have no skills or knowledge to impart on this. I realize I really don't know. And here's a good example though. If I really needed to answer that question, I would say, well, I'm going to go find out. Like I would go do the research on what kinds of science has been done, what kinds of, because there's a lot of education theory, a lot of it's empirical. There's a lot of literature on this. You go find out what can you teach and what should you teach? Like for example, at kindergarten level, I'm sure there's answers to this. There's probably stuff that's been found that empirically works and doesn't. And I would go look for that rather than trying to make up something and pontificate from the armchair. My advice to people would be go find out what scientists have already figured out about this. Now that's my ignorant perspective, but where are you on this? It sounds like you've studied it more than I have.
No. So I I started wanting to answer that question because a couple of years ago, when I was beginning working on my course, I saw that video about scientists who go to a kindergarten and they ask kids some questions to show their I'm having trouble finding my words tonight.
Right.
The sense that the tribal issue, the tribalism we have as children. So they ask question. I'm going to show you pictures of two kids, and one of them doesn't clean themselves behind the ears. So which one is it? And so they show a picture of a white kid and a black kid. And so if the kid is white, 85% of the time they will show the black kid and vice versa. And so that's already the tribalism that we need to fight. But also what struck me was that we put the child in a situation where they don't have enough information to have an opinion, and we force them to give an answer. And that was very wrong, in my opinion.
Yeah. Oh, that's a really good point. Yeah, I like how you put that. And I would expand on that with just the general idea that I was pointing out before, which was the encouraging asking questions, and not just stopping there, but also like helping them figure out how to actually answer those questions on their own. And so, that's the kind of way that I would approach it. I mean, it would be more difficult and challenging from an educational perspective at the kindergarten level, but I know teachers can do that, right? They're trained to do this. So we could do this much more. Yeah.
So I'm following a project in France because right now it's not open to the public, but they are trying to put critical thinking in schools, and so they started a project with half scientists, half teachers, and they try to talk each other to find what works on the scientific side and what can be done with kids from the teacher's side. And they try to come up with a list of exercises, techniques at different ages, so we can teach critical thinking. And I saw a couple of videos about this a few months ago, and they're still working on it, but they don't communicate on it, unfortunately. And I think it's really, really unfortunate, because we need to tell that this is happening, because this is very important. I have no knowledge of any other country that does that so far, and I think it's a very good idea. France has a very, very bad education system, but that's very, very good.
Yeah, and it sounds like eventually this is a study that will be published, I'm assuming, at some point, or
hopefully, yeah.
Yeah. So no, we need more research like that. That's extremely valuable. And yeah, like I said, like my knowledge and advice is more at the upper grades than that, but definitely we need work like that for figuring out how do we get those mindsets. And I think the focus largely at that age is more at the attitudes. And then like the real complex skills can come later, like, cognitive science and logic, like that's really like, later year teaching subjects, but the mental attitudes, the perspectives, the points of view, the questioning, the how to, the idea that you can actually try to figure out the answer for yourself. And also the idea that you can be wrong about things, and the idea that you might not know the answer about things. Just like you were saying, like we take these things for granted, but making students comfortable with them at early ages would build the groundwork for their receptivity to those more advanced skills later on.
Yeah, the mental postures I was talking about earlier, that's exactly
the phrase,
what we could teach at a very early age.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah. So what's the reception to your course been so far?
Good. I mean, students always love it. It's one of my more popular courses. It's not my most popular course, but it's one of them. It's up there. Right now I'm teaching it one course, 1 month, every month. So I'm teaching every course every month. So like I can have students take it in any month. Consequently, this thins out the classes. So I'm doing classes. Maybe I have like 1 to 5 students at most per class, but then spread out over 12 months. It used to be they would be concentrated a little bit more, but now I'm more flexible so more people can take it, because not everybody can take the course in one particular month of a year. So my classes are small, but the reception's always been good. I've had a lot of positive feedback. And of course, I enjoy most of the students that are very engaging, that like ask a lot of questions and get more involved in the forum discussions that we have in the classes.
When did you start teaching it?
Gosh, I forget now. It's gone through many iterations. I started teaching it, I think, for Center for Inquiry back when they had an online school, and that's no longer a thing. Then Students for Secular PSA, Partners for Secular Activism. They had one, but they've had to close that down to retool it. So I was teaching for them for a little bit. Now I just teach myself. So through Google Groups and my website, I just teach the courses myself. I'm not affiliated with anyone, just for people who want to know this stuff and pick the brain of a PhD who's written published works on these things. And so that's what I do now. And it's not through any particular affiliated group, but I'm always interested in hearing about how other people are teaching the same skills. And so that I can bring that perspective into my courses as well.
Yeah, I haven't found a place to teach it so far. I started prospecting a couple of weeks ago, but yeah, hopefully I will find a place. My first idea was to, and still is, to teach it face to face in professional environments. You have companies that teach IT stuff, technical stuff, and sometimes also soft skills. And so I'm prospecting those companies to tell them, look, that's a soft skill you need to teach. And so that's my path right now. And so I'm still waiting.
There's an organization I know that's been doing something similar to that called CFAR, the Center for Applied Rationality. And they've developed a lot of tools. Now their focus is at the corporate level. So they're like teaching courses for business executives, but they teach for any group. So I think they're mostly focusing on adults rather than kids. But they've developed a lot of tools, and they have a lot of experience. And they've done some research as well. So there's something to look into. I don't know. It's been a while since I've checked in with them, so I don't know how they're doing their teaching or anything like that now. But I know it's a pretty successful organization, and it's one to at least look at the model of.
Yeah, I looked into their website about 6-8 months ago, and it seemed very, very, very advanced and very, they know what they're doing.
Yeah, and like I said, they're focusing usually on people who are already college graduates. It's kind of like their focus group, or their main aim. But that might have changed since last I looked at them. They might actually have more different grade level materials. It's been a while since I've checked their site.
Yeah, I'll look into it again, because maybe I could offer a perspective on teaching in a different language. I don't know if they teach only in English, but
that's a good point too. Yeah, right. We need it in other languages for sure.
Yeah. So how we talked about skepticism so far. How can you define it? Because every person you ask it has a different definition.
Yeah,
so
and everyone thinks they're a skeptic, even the ones who aren't. Yeah. It's another word that I tend to avoid because of its ambiguity, for the same reason. And as I was mentioning before, like there's healthy and unhealthy skepticism. Actually, one of my focuses lately, I'd say in like the last 2 or 3 years, I used to, for many years, for about 2 decades, a lot of what I did was just debunk things, right? And so like, well, this is false, here's why, and whatever it is, whether it's in religion or history or philosophy or something like that, or politics, with society, social theory, and all of those things. But in the last like 2 or 3 years, I've been focusing on methodology, and not just like the methodology of critical thinking, but the methodology of people who don't critically think, right? And trying to understand, like, because I'm starting to see common patterns of thought that lead to QAnon or flat earthism or Christianity or Islam. Like all the same patterns of thinking lead to these false belief systems, and they cross over. You can see they're a shared package, almost like it's an anti-critical thinking skill set that these people develop. And so I've been looking at what are those common features, and I deal a lot with Christian apologetics. So a lot of these methods I find are unique to that, but I find that those same methods spill over and they're applied in other false belief areas as well. And so that's actually been a helpful thing, is to try and figure out, like, see these patterns, be able to show them to people. So you can see that, oh, here's a behavior that you're seeing across a whole diverse group of people doing the same things, coming to completely different beliefs. And you can show structurally why that is having the effect that it's having, that they're coming to false conclusions, and it's obvious that the method wouldn't get them to the truth, right? And I think part of the sort of negative side of it, the advantageous negative side, is showing bad thinking, so that people can see, like, why that bad thinking is bad and why it actually will mislead you, and just recognize it. And so that, and then of course emotionally not want to do that yourself. Like, so, yeah, you're right, that is actually not sound reasoning. I don't want to engage in that kind of reasoning. And so now you know how to spot it and avoid it. So looking at that aspect of it has been very important to me lately, and has actually informed my ability to teach critical thinking, because I can show people these patterns of thought. And one of the, just as an example, one of them is the leaving out of evidence, right? So, like, it's very common to pick a piece of evidence or a small body of evidence and then draw a conclusion and use, I've just proved my conclusion. And so, well, okay, let's go look at all the evidence you left out and put it back in and see what happens. Do we get to the same conclusion? And then often we don't. And so leaving evidence out is like one of these techniques that you see Christian apologists do, you see QAnon people do, you see Marxists and libertarians. You know, they're both on opposite sides of the same spectrum. They both do it. And so you find this. And so once you start culling that out of people and they stop doing those things, and their belief system starts zeroing in on more accurate, nuanced, truth-based worldviews, and I've seen it happen. So I know it works. So that's just an example among the kinds of things that we can teach and improve the world with.
Yeah, and it's also important to explain to people how this informs their actions. Sorry, because I often say that discriminations are all based on the lack of critical thinking, because each discrimination, at its core, it has false information, which you should get rid of with critical thinking. But what happened with Trump's election, for example, was that many people said, "Oh, look now." Plenty of racist people are getting out. No, they were already here. The only difference is that he allowed them to speak, because before then, the Overton window was more to the left.
Yes.
And so they couldn't express their feelings. So since they couldn't say it, they expressed it in a different way by voting for someone.
Yeah, like right. Yeah, it's funny. In some ways, that's there's a slight positive end to that, is that it's much better to see it visible than when it was hidden. When it was hidden, people could deny that it existed. Now it's out there. They still deny it exists, but it's more obvious that they're full of it, now, because it's so much more blatant. And by the way, for people, your audience who might not know what the Overton window is, I highly recommend Googling it. Wikipedia has a good article on the Overton window and why it's important, and that's a good example
made a video
of.
On it also on my channel.
Oh, excellent! Yes, so there you go. So your audience should go check out your video on the Overton window, because that's it's one of those things that once you understand it, it's like those eureka moments. Like you understand so much more about the world. As soon as you understand the Overton window, you're like, oh shit, okay, that explains a lot of things. It's a useful tool to see how rhetoric can be used to change public opinion by moving the Overton window, and it's one of those little strategies of how people get manipulated that I think critical thinking would teach you how to spot, so you see it happening. And also, of course, it's a skill that when you want to move the Overton, when it should be moved, then you know that the first thing you need to do is move the window before you jump all the way to where you want to go. And so that there's positive and negative uses for that knowledge. But I find that super important. And like you were saying with the with prejudices in general. I mean, I think there's black and white thinking gets into this, and I mean like extreme views. It's either A or B, and there's nothing in between. So everyone assumes that if you have sort of you've just been raised cognitively or non-cognitively to just have certain prejudices, and you don't know you have them necessarily. They aren't necessarily beliefs that you like affirm. They're your intuition. So if you're going by your gut, and like you were mentioning just the one study about who's dirtier than someone else, and they're not like thinking like, oh, I'm going to go on this belief that I have. No, they rely on their gut. Their gut just turns out this answer, and it's something that their culture has imbued on them, or their parents have imbued on them, their peers. They don't know that their brain has been culturated to think in a certain way. And so if you point that out, then people immediately assume that you're accusing them of being like a card-carrying member of the KKK or, white supremacist or something. It's like, no, there's a difference between cognitive racism, where you're deliberately less like, we want a white nation and ship all the black people back to Africa. If you have that sort of explicit, you're actually aware of your racism. That's cognitive racism. And we have a lot more of that than we ought to have, even today in the United States. To the point that it's our number one terrorist problem is white supremacists in the United States. But most of racism is not cognitive. It's non-cognitive, meaning it's below the level of your cognitive awareness. And people don't like to hear that about themselves necessarily, right? So, but it's nevertheless one of those examples of cognitive biases that the culture has imbued in people. And so you have to figure out ways to work around this, this underlying software that's been built into you against your will. It's not like you chose it. It's just you've been acculturated that way. And so being aware of it allows you to start bypassing it and start changing it. And you can't flip a switch and change it overnight. It's like habituation. It takes time. But you have to know it's there, and you have to be able to admit that it's there, and that you need to take steps to work around it rather than just relying on your gut all the time, because your gut is going to literally what you're asking when you say rely on your gut is you're asking rely on all your prejudices and biases, right? And so relying on your gut is not the best thing for somebody. If prejudice or bias can get in there, your gut is not the way to go. You need to be more critical even of your gut. Like, why is your gut coming up with these differential responses? And one of the things I teach in my critical thinking course is a particular tool for doing this, which I call forced perspective. Which is not the forced perspective in filmmaking. Forced perspective in filmmaking is when you put a camera, you have someone walk up to a little cardboard house, but because you've got the perspective, they look taller than the house, right? So that's forced perspective in cameras, but you can do this cognitively. So cognitive forced perspective is where you have, you think a certain thing. And one of the tools I show is like, Islamophobia is one of the ones that I show. And I'm a huge critic of Islam. I think the religion is false and a problem and so on. But Islamophobia is also a real thing and is a problem and so on. And so I've written a lot on that aspect of it. And so I have people I look at all these common prejudice assumptions about Muslims in general. And then I force people to ask, why don't they think the same things about Christians, even though they should think even more so about Christians or these things. And one of the examples is the murdering apostates, like killing apostates. There's actually nothing in the Quran that actually says that you should kill apostates. You can cherry pick verses to make it say that, but it doesn't actually say that by itself. Whereas the Bible explicitly says, one of the commandments of God that Moses carried down from the mountain literally is that you will kill apostates. And even your own family, it says, you'll stone them to death. So that's actually explicitly in the Bible that the Christians revere. So it forces people to think like, well, why am I not condemning all Christians in the same terms that I'm condemning Muslims? Like, what is causing my differential attitude here? And I have and then people start exploring, I have a more nuanced perspective on Christians. Like, yeah, right. Maybe you should have a more nuanced perspective on Muslims too. And so how you get people to do that is by forcing them to some attitude they have, some belief they have, flip the script, change what it is that you're talking about, and then ask them, why is it different now? I've did a talk once on how you can do this with men and women too, like gender bias as well as a similar thing. People make a lot of assumptions, but if you say, well, if you swap this woman out for a man, would that assumption arise? And if not, why? Like, what's changed? And so this kind of forced perspective can teach people that they have these biases and then how to give them a tool for working around them. And so I think that this is a critical thinking tool. It's one of the things that's in my class.
It's the same thinking behind the veil of ignorance. Rule the world.
It's a related concept.
Yes, it's basically the same.
Yeah, for people who don't know what we're talking about, it's John Rawls came up with the idea of the veil of ignorance, and I might not do this justice. He wrote it much better than I did, but the basic idea is if you could arrange society, the rules of society, the assumptions of society, and everything in such a way, in any way you wanted, and then but you don't get to choose who you're going to be in that society, right? And then once you realize that you're not going to get to choose who you are, then you start thinking about how does the system actually affect people that are maybe disabled, right? People who are disabled, or well, what if you were a woman in that system and you're not a woman in this system, right? So like it forces you to think like, oh, okay, so it gives you this a different perspective, which is another example of a forced perspective thinking.
I would like just to acknowledge people in the chat. Hi, Kat. I assume you meant hi, Cindy and Dr. Carrier. Question by Godless Granny: isn't everyone raised with prejudices? Yes, that's basically what we've been saying.
Yeah, we need to be aware of them. I agree, and it ties into what we started with, which is this idea that our brains don't work. Their brains are not intelligently designed. They're very bad. And there are a lot of these cognitive biases. I tell people all the time, go to Wikipedia and type in list of cognitive biases. They actually have a page, and it's hundreds of them. And those are that's not even a complete list. But it just shows you like all the ways our brains think poorly. Now, if you understand that like everyone, that's just everyone. That's not like certain people have these problems. No, these are cognitive biases that we all have. And you figure you have these from birth, so you're raised with them. Your parents have them, so that means everyone in your culture has them. All your peers have them. So, what is the statistical probability that you could go through all that juggernaut and not have a single bias or prejudice evolve, or a single false belief that would affect your intuition and your gut thinking and stuff? It's virtually zero, right? Like it's guaranteed to lead to some sort of false presumptions and prejudices. And in fact, there's some cognitive biases that you can show deliberately, that actually directly cause prejudice thinking. And you can, in terms of evolutionary psychology, you can explain why we evolved that. It's because we didn't evolve to be truth seekers. We evolved to be just sowers, right? Just get by just enough, a little bit better than the next guy.
We need a fast answer rather than a true answer.
Yes, that's right. And that's with the fast thinking and slow thinking, right? The system 1 and system 2. Yeah. So sometimes we have to make these snap judgments. But if you have a machine that's designed to make snap judgments, it's going to do it poorly a lot. So you need to have that system, the other system, right? To like check that, be a check on it, and be a check and balance against it, so that you're not constantly governed by these prejudices that had built into you before you had chance to consent or even choose it, right? Because you're raised as kids this way. You don't know, right? And you don't even know how you're being influenced. I just recently posted on my Facebook wall, there was a recent study on, actually a bunch of studies lately. There have been many, but there were a few recently, and there's an article on these about how boys and girls are raised differently. And it focused specifically on the fact that the parents aren't even aware of the way they're raising boys and girls differently. And it showed like what the causal effect of that is. And it's just simple decisions about like whether you roughhouse or not. Because boys oftentimes there's a lot of like forcible play, but the point of it was like that teaches you the difference between real violence and play violence, and how to, if you think of like a cat, for example, if it's playing with you, it knows not to draw its claws, right? And so that's actually an important skill, right? But if you don't do that with girls, like it changes the way that they're enculturated, and so you can do the same thing with like toys and with attitudes about who's questioning you accept more, who's uncouthness you accept more, and there's like a lot of different ways that subtle messages that the parents don't even know that they're doing, but can be objectively observed and shown to be different, lead to different outcomes in terms of the attitudes and assumptions that boys and girls have as they grow up. And so this is a good example of how prejudices arise.
I forgot to ask you, are you short on time? Do you need to stop at the exact hour, or can we?
We should wrap up actually, but we've had a good talk though. I think we've covered a lot of really cool subjects.
Yeah, I hope we will meet again, because I had other questions, but So again, thank you very, very much for being here. It was
thanks for having me on.
Pleasure to talk about this with you. Thank everyone in the chat, and can you Where can we find you?
richardcarrier.info. So just my name is one word, .info. That has everything. So you can find my Twitter feed there, my Facebook feed link. My blog is there. My books you can find out there. All my classes you can learn about there. Every month I teach 10 different courses, and they're just simple, cheap, 1 month self-directed learning with all the questions you want to ask me. A PhD expert on the subject, you get my whole attention for a month. And so all of that stuff, anything you want to know about me, my biography and all of that stuff is on the same place. So richardcarrier.info.
Cool. So if you like this video, please like and subscribe. I don't have a Patreon yet. I still don't know if I'm going to set up one, but I have an Amazon wishlist in my info down below. If you want to help my channel, you can go there and buy a book, because there's only book in there. And so thank you again for watching, everyone, and I see you next time. Bye.
Yeah. Bye-bye.